Capitalism is a beautiful thing, but when it comes to politics and debating, people often define it as something that it is not. You have these resist capitalism folks that try to paint it as something like exploitation or hating the poor or something negative like that. But for the people that actually push for capitalism, well, what is it as they define it? The two most prominent schools of economic thought that favor capitalism are of the Chicago and Austrian schools. So let's refer to the definitions of some of those leading economists. Anarcho-capitalist Murray Rothbard defined it as a network of free and voluntary exchanges in which producers work, produce, and exchange their products for the products of others through prices voluntarily arrived. Chicago economist Thomas Sowell says that capitalism is not an ism. It is closer to being the opposite because it is simply the freedom of ordinary people to make whatever economic transactions they can mutually agree to. So in short, capitalism is the private ownership of goods and services and the free and voluntary exchange of those private goods and services. Regardless of the etymology or how Karl Marx used it, this is what we generally refer to when we talk about capitalism. You can strawman it all you want. People often blame capitalism for things that it had nothing to do with or things that it isn't at all, like corporatism or government intervention and favoritism, which makes it a dishonest market. One of the most ridiculous and sadly the more often used example of this is when people try to pin slavery on capitalism or vice versa. One of my favorite economists, Dr. Walter Williams, kind of addressed this.
Thomas Jefferson had slaves, and the free market essentially created slavery, but the free market wasn't going to take that away. It wasn't going to take discrimination away. It wasn't going to take Jim Crow laws away. So without some kind of government intervention, why wouldn't that have continued?
Well, I don't think slavery is consistent with the free market. That is, the free market has something to do with private property rights and self-ownership, and slavery is a violation of the essential principles of free markets. So slavery is more, it's something like the forcible use of one person to serve the purposes of another, and that has to be offensive to anybody who believes in personal liberty.
Now, in order to say capitalism can't work or that it doesn't work, you get people that try to selectively point to different aspects of history, like child laborers and things like that. They start fear-mongering and saying things like, well, without government regulation, racism would take over, the rich would take over, and the sun would just blow up. And they never apply that logic to things like, you know, government, the state, that is a monopoly on use of force and violence, which is the most dangerous tool throughout history. And then they try to come up with these what-if scenarios, and if you don't have an answer right there on the spot, well, capitalism can't work. It assumes they are like the smartest people in the room, but more dangerously, they are asking you to centrally plan, which is the opposite of capitalism. The reason why we want capitalism is because we recognize how dangerous and ineffective central planning is. It's also the least coercive, and it allows individuals to freely come up with solutions to these scenarios. Unlike government, free individuals actually have an incentive to do this, but also do it efficiently because they're competing firms. Government just gets a handful of bureaucrats and politicians and legislators, and they write in laws and come up with budgets for entire geographical areas with millions of people. It's a failed strategy, and part of the reason why the US is piled up like what, $20 trillion worth of debt. It's an impossible task. Plus they can just tax or print the money because, you know, the Federal Reserve would just sell your unborn kids into debt slavery. So what real incentive do they have to do right? And people that oppose capitalism love to mention the poor, not understanding that capitalism is the best way for the poor to raise their living standards. But under capitalism, you still are free to help the poor. Again, it's about free and voluntary exchanges. Charities can still exist, and even today, they are way more efficient than the government's trillion-dollar failure at fighting poverty, which literally incentivizes people to fail throughout the welfare state. I can't help but notice how weird it is for people to oppose capitalism by nitpicking examples throughout history. These examples are often of regulated markets, but let's think about it. Government has been responsible for like 250 million deaths in the last century, and that isn't really including foreign or internal wars. And of those, none of them really came about by some honest politician saying that he wanted to abolish all regulations and privatize everything, saying, hey, I'm of the capitalist party, and if I win, we're gonna get rid of all the government regulations, the taxation, so that society can be free and voluntary, and you guys can just rule over yourselves. And then that guy went and won, and then that resulted in a bunch of deaths that hardly has ever happened. But you know what has? Socialists and communists and people like Zedong, Pol Pot, Stalin, and many others that have tanked entire economies and killed millions in the process. So they want capitalism to pay for children or things like that working dangerous jobs, but they don't want to pay for the likes of people running on platforms of helping people through regulation and taxation, that of which resulted in far more deaths. Look, capitalism is not perfect, nor is it utopian. No rational capitalist even pretends that it is such, but it is the least coercive, and its ideas have historically lifted people out of poverty. So to say that you're against capitalism is to say that you want to use force to build your ideal society, which is arrogant and immoral. So when you approach capitalism, try to understand it as people actually advocate before you ask these stupid what-if scenarios demanding immediate answers. Understand what it is that you actually imply when you try to oppose free and voluntary exchange of private goods and services. Stop trying to mask your deep authoritarianism with caring for the poor, these fraud humanitarian efforts. In reality, the capitalist actually cares more about the poor than the non-capitalist, because we want a system that allows the best opportunity for people to move up economic classes. Heck, I grew up in a single parent household without a lot of money, and I like to treat poor folks and every individual as if they are individuals, not these defenseless animals that can't move their world unless Big Daddy government or the collective moves it for them. Stop using caring for the poor as a scapegoat to control them. You ain't fooling anybody. I guarantee there's gonna be some socialists and communists in the comments talking about, this guy's an idiot, he's stupid, Uncle Tom, LOL. Yeah, shut up and make an argument.